Waves of the Indian Ocean slowly coming in on a crisp autumn morning. I'm here in Sardinia Bay in Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, and I'm in a vegetation type known as St. Francis dune thicket, which is a mosaic, a mixture of two biomes, namely the subtropical thicket and the Cape fynbos. And we've had quite a large fire about 1.5 to 2 months ago, and this week a good amount of rain. So it will be interesting to see what plants are coming up from the burnt ruins. So the St. Francis dune thicket fynbos mosaic is an interesting vegetation type. It runs from about St. Francis Bay in the Eastern Cape to about Port Elizabeth, and it's restricted to coastal areas with fairly recently formed dunes, Holocene dunes. It's interesting in that we have two biomes which are physiognomically different, they're structurally different, and they also have a different ecological disturbances. So fynbos is fire driven, whereas subtropical thicket is generally not fire driven, and it keeps out fire. The thicket component is generally restricted to areas with deeper sand, dune soils, and also areas which are protected from fire, such as dune slacks, whereas the fynbos is in the more open areas with the shallower soils. But in many areas we get almost a perfect blend of plants from both affinities, both subtropical thicket and fynbos, such as this area which hasn't burnt in the last few months, and we can take a look at how we have both sort of plant groups living side by side. So we have a Cercia over here. This is Cercia glauca, and this is a very common species in thicket, in dune thicket, and the genus itself, Cercia formnirus, is very common in thicket, the biome itself. And right next to it we have Metalasia maricata, which is the dune blombos, and this is a very typical dune fynbos species. And we can see some of the I guess differences in leaf characteristics between the fynbos species and the thicket species. The fynbos species, sort of why it's given that name, with very thin ericoid leaves, and then the thicket species generally being more broad-leaved and evergreen as well. We also have a Euclea racemosa in the distance, and some Passerina rigida just emerging out of the bushes over there. Fynbos generally has three main groups of plants, or three main plant families which are iconic to fynbos, and that's the proteas, the ericas, and the ristios. The proteas are almost completely absent from the dune fynbos over here. The ericoid component is limited, in that there's only two real erica species, both threatened, that occur here, but there is a fairly important restio component. Most of the component species in dune fynbos are shrubs of the Asteraceae, the Fabaceae, and the Rutaceae. So the Rutaceae are the buchus, and this is a member of that family. This is not a buchu per se, this is Coleonema pulchellum, which has a wonderful aromatic citrus smell. And just below it we have a similar looking species, and this is a young Metalasia, in fact. So this is part of the Naphidae tribe of the sunflower family, which is very, very common in dune fynbos. So it's represented by things like Metalasia, by Helichrysum as well as Acheranthemum. And here's another member of the daisy family. This is Felicia echinata. We don't see any flowers popping up just yet. So looking down this road, we can see that on the left we have mostly unburnt vegetation, and on the right it's almost completely burned. So that was partly because of this road acting as a fire break, but this road was also built on a calcrete outcropping with lot shallower soils and less vegetation, which meant the fire did not have fuel to pass through. But it gives us a decent opportunity to compare what this vegetation normally looks like to what the succession is looking like. And the fynbos and thicket generally have different life strategies to tolerate this fire. Most of the thicket shrubs here, like the eucalypts, like the cercias and so on, are geoxylic, which means they have underground tissue which resprout fairly soon after fire, whereas the fynbos species generally reseed and take a little bit longer to appear after fire. And we can see some examples of that if we do go over into the section that was burnt. So here's a nice example of one of these geoxylic species, commonly called underground trees as well. This is another cercia, a different species of cercia, this is Cercia levigata, and we can see in an area with pretty much nothing else going on, we have these little sprouts of this thicket shrub. And all of these little sprouts aren't individuals themselves, but rather they're one individual, and that's sprouting from underground woody tissue. So all the biomass above the ground has been burnt or killed off, but the plant is still living underground, protected from the fire. So immediately after the fire, there is enough stored energy for these plants to shoot up sprouts above the ground, and they arguably play a fairly important ecological role as well, just adding some ground cover very quickly after fire. As we can see, a lot of the area is still very much exposed to the elements, and not a lot of microsites for some fynbos species to re-establish. So I am somewhat surprised at the lack of species coming up after this fire. I suppose it is still fairly recent. Apart from the resprouts in Cercia levigatas, we have quite a bit of this grass coming up. This is Imperata cylindrica. It's a cosmopolitan species of grass that normally occurs in the little depressions in this dune thicket fynbos landscape where water can accumulate, and this is pretty much all over the place. It's probably the most abundant species in this post-fire environment. Other than the cercias and the Imperata grass, there is a ruderal species from the ice fig family, the Azoaceae, and this is Azoon, most likely Azoon glenoides. It does like disturbance in the thicket inland, where we do have a lot of overbrowsing. They're often very dominant in degraded thicket, and similarly here they've taken advantage of the recently disturbed post-fire landscape. So this is Azoon glenoides, the bacon fig. And I've just come across this lovely small little piece of dune fynbos that was not burnt, and this is occurring in an area with some shallower soils. You can see the calcrete outcrop over here, and yeah, very heavily asteraceous, mostly dominated by Metalasia maricata, but also this species, not of the Asteraceae but rather of the buckthorn family, the Rhamnaceae, and this is a Phylica ericoides, also a very common species in dune fynbos. In terms of the sunflower family, the Asteraceae, we have another example over here of Acheranthemum. This is most likely Acheranthemum argenteum, and the same tribe as the Metalasia and the Helichrysum that we also get here. We have more of that Coleonema pulchellum, which is part of the Buchu family, and we don't have a lot of the thicket shrubs coming into this area. We would have some grasses there, some Stipegrostis in between, but it's a very typical patch of dune fynbos in this region. And just on the fringes by the road, we have a sprawling species of the Fabaceae family. Just after flowering, this is Ortholobium bracteolatum, I think now renamed into Soralia, moved into that genus. We also have a slightly larger shrub in between all the fynbos. This shrub, although looking like one of the subtropical thicket species, actually related to the Cape thicket species, so they do occur fairly far down the west coast. This is Colpoon compressum, previously known as Osiris compressor, and it is hemiparasitic. So it does get some hemiparasitic root parasite, so it might be parasitizing one of the phylicos or metallurgias surrounding it. And the dune fynbos here does possess a few endangered species, a few endemic species. One of them here is this shrub, Rapania gilliana, known as the dwarf Cape beech. Much smaller than its more widespread relative Rapania melanofluus, which is a forest tree. But these are limited to the coast here. And here's a nice example of some of the communities that grow on this very shallow soil. You can see it's a very prominent outcrop over here, and we see the acheranthemum surrounding it, some more of that phylica. We do have a marilla over here, so this is Marilla quercifolia. That species name deriving from the shape of the leaves, which resemble an oak. And we do have some colour as well. James Britannia microphylla, member of the Scrophulariaceae family. And similar to the colpoon we saw just a bit earlier, we have another hemiparasite, and this is Thesium fragilum. So just come across another species, very common part of the thicket component in the dune thicket fynbos mosaic. This is the white milkwood, Sidon Ocelon inerme, and at the moment this is a sprawling shrub that's about I would say a meter tall, but they can get to be proper forest trees, which is showing some of the plasticity in growth form that these thicket trees are the ability. So I'm just in an area here, a little dip in the landscape, where the skeletons of these burnt trees reach almost 3 meters in height. So this was an invasive species, an extremely invasive species in this habitat, Rooikrans, which is Acacia cyclops. These species originated from Australia and was brought into stabilized dunes in the early part of the 20th century. I can tell the Acacia cyclops by just on the ends. You can see some of these galls, which is a biocontrol actually introduced to curb the proliferation of the species. And if you look below, there are not a lot of recovery in the landscape. We don't see that much of that spreading Cercia levigata. This is a pretty small area of Acacia cyclops, but it has attained a forest-like stature, so it's probably not cleared for a very long time. And when this does happen, it does appear to disrupt the disturbance ecology of this coastal systems. So because they can grow so much larger than the surrounding fynbos and thicket, they do keep out a lot of the light, and when fires do come through, they burn at a higher intensity just because of the increased fuel load. So I've seen some areas near to Sardinia Bay where we had these expansive patches of these acacia forests. A fire has gone through and there's very little recovery. It's mostly restricted to the very weedy native species like this Solanum africanum over here. So luckily enough, this area of acacia forest was pretty small. I think further towards the east though, we do get big areas, big patches of acacia cyclops that burnt, and the recovery of that system is going to be a lot different to the recovery in the areas where there were no invasion. Yeah, and just to end off the video, I have found one of the two Erica species that I mentioned occur here, and this is Erica chloroloma. Unfortunately, we don't see any of the really conspicuous red tubular flowers here, as they are a little bit spent. We've seen that one's just finished. But this is Erica chloroloma, and I think it's listed as vulnerable and fairly restricted to the coastal areas around this part of the Eastern Cape.